there's anything you want to add to that, Joseph.
Not really. So I'm just checking to make sure that we are actually going live because that's always a perennial problem. I think it is working. Please leave a comment if you can see the live stream or if you saw the intro. Yeah, yeah. Hopefully this is working. Yes. Okay. As far as the coronavirus or the whole situation, the whole current events thing goes, um, yeah, there's layers. I mean, there's health, which we've been learning a lot more about as we find out the infection rates are higher, the death rate gets lower, um, and that's interesting. And then there's the response to it. And the response to it has gotten so heavy-handed in some areas, like Michigan recently. That's been crazy. And then China has been trying so hard to cover their tracks. Really, um, it's just like the whole world's in an uproar. And then we've all had 7 weeks of staying home. For me personally, because that's probably the most honest thing that I can talk about with the whole situation. I moved in the middle of the pandemic, and so I couldn't ask for help with the move or didn't feel ethical doing so. And then moved my family into a new environment, and that part worked okay. It was unpleasant taking 2 days to load a moving van and 2 days to unload it, but we did it. And then the next part was the new 3 or 4 weeks that we've been here, not being able to meet the neighbors, and it's been so profoundly isolating. Um, it's been a little bit crazy. I mean, finally, I have a couple of friends that we trust and like, and we had them over, and it was so nice to be around people again. It's easy to forget that I'm a social animal like all other humans, and then something like this comes along and reminds me very forcefully that community is a human need. Um, so yeah, that's been my recent experience with this thing. How about you? Have you used all this free time to
Well,
learn everything and do everything awesome and take everything to the next level?
you
Or,
know it.
of course,
You know it. I know everything now.
yeah, you have a
Actually,
beard and you know things.
I'll have to be honest. Yeah, well, one of the first things I actually did was big experience. However, I think here's something that I'll mention on the personal note before we move on to sort of public policy or whatever else we want to talk about. My sister sent an email to our family. She lives in Virginia, and she sent an email to our family with something somebody posted on social media. And the main thrust of the thing was that everybody is in a very different boat during the coronavirus pandemic, right? There are some individuals for whom this is a near existential threat, right? You might not have, perhaps a lot of food or a lot of savings, um, and you desperately need to work. And so if the economy shuts down and you're not working, that's actually not, that's not relaxation inducing at all. That's not a source of comfort at all. That's not, a reason to celebrate and say, oh, now I can go read the books I haven't read yet that I wanted to read. And it's like, no, I'm not going to be able to pay rent. I can't work. We are all going to die. Right. Whereas, for other people, it's certainly the case that their lives have not been, affected in their lives have not been significantly affected in important ways. If you were already working from home, maybe you already weren't seeing that many people. There's certainly people for whom the coronavirus has not affected as much as it has other people, and affected them in different ways. So I guess I just think it's very interesting that, and actually this is a good segue into public policy. I think it's very interesting that there are such a different variety of experiences that people actually have, even though nominally we are all experiencing the same global event.
Yeah.
Even though there is one unifying current that runs globally, one unifying event, the individual events of our lives and the actual concrete experiences of individuals are wildly different.
Yeah.
I don't know if you want to comment on that, but I think it's a phenomenal segue into the public policy discussion, because this is something that I've been struck by as I've thought over the last few weeks, um, is the degree to which sort of monolithic public policies are very poorly suited to deal with situations like this in many
Yeah.
cases.
I was just digging through, last week I was just digging through a bill that was proposed in the Utah legislature in a special session a couple weeks ago called House Bill 3009. And it didn't even make it out of committee. And it caused such a wild outcry on social media that this was tyranny. And what it did was it basically controlled who had access to the power to create a shutdown on the local and state level. So you have local governments at both a city level, a municipal level, and also at a county level. And this bill was going to take the power to create a generalized shutdown or a tailored shutdown for something like a coronavirus outbreak, and remove that from the health department of the area and put it squarely in the hands of the elected officials. Because right now, that power under various emergency bills that have already passed into law is in the hands of the health department and in the hands of the local executives and in the hands of the local legislatures. And they were going to remove it from one of those branches. And so the new structure was going to say a local executive can issue one of these orders. It only lasts 14 days unless it gets renewed by the local legislature. And in order to make this order, they have to consult at least with the local health department, so they're not cut out entirely. What a lot of people in Utah didn't realize is that these powers already existed. And so when they read the language of the bill, they thought new powers were being granted. And so it was so funny that a bill that was designed to restrict or appropriately cabin off these rather broad powers that we've seen used was attacked and lambasted as a power grab, which is kind of ironic. So it got killed, but the ideas are now circulating around on the Capitol in Utah, and so maybe that'll come back. Yeah, it just got me thinking a little bit about localism. You want decisions made close to home, where they are the most tailored and relevant to the local conditions. Because out here in the very rural country of Utah, there's a couple of moving parts. One, people live very remotely, pretty commonly. Most people are, well, I won't say most people. There is a substantial minority that live off-grid here. And, they don't have to have any contact with anybody if they don't want to. And if a couple of them get together and chat and have a house party, the risk of COVID infection is really, really, really low. On the other hand, we don't even have one intensive.
In New York City.
Oh yeah, where everybody has had a bajillion other contacts elsewhere, and so, I mean, the web is denser, and so it's easier to spread from the nodes. But we also don't have any intensive care beds. And so for a short time, the major hospitals, there's a risk analysis here. The chances of it happening are low, but the consequences if it does are very high. So how do you juggle that? And for a short time, the large hospitals, the large hospitals in the Salt Lake Valley, which is kind of the main valley in Utah, were saying that they would refuse any patients who were helicoptered in from these rural counties, and they've since retracted that. But crazy scenario. So the situation really is different in different places, and it would be nice to see different solutions applied in different places, especially since the top-down policies of China work so disastrously poorly. They'll claim what their numbers are, but they don't even trust their own GDP numbers. At the top levels of the Chinese Communist Party, the way they actually measure GDP is not with GDP figures from the lower levels that are reporting up, but with measures like how much steel was consumed, things that are much more reliable. Yeah.
If anyone is listening or looking at China's numbers right now and doesn't take a grain of salt, no, man.
That is a criminal level of gullibility.
You're right. It's something that's very interesting, the coronavirus response, and I'm far person who said this, obviously, is that if you take the equation, United States is actually looking a lot better than it otherwise is. It's arguable that we have.
Sorry, the connection has not been super good for about the last 30 seconds. So if you wouldn't mind repeating that thought, that would be helpful, for at least for my sake.
Sure, it's not a live stream with me on it unless there's technical problem. What I'm saying is that, if you remove New York City, United States make the case that the United States right now has in New York City a national problem. And by saying that, I don't mean to minimize I don't mean to dismiss the fact that there are hospitalizations and deaths in other parts of the country, obviously, and I don't mean to say that we should just dig a canal around New York City and kick them out of the union or anything crazy like that. That's not the point at all. But my point interesting.
Sorry, please repeat that point, because I totally missed the connection. So New York City's having the harshest trouble. Can't hear you. Internet difficulties. That's another thing, how dependent we are on the internet, particularly when we're all telecommuting. Gonna give this another try. You all right, Joseph?
Yeah, sorry. I fundamentally cannot trust my be betrayed by your own telecommuter. I'll just leap right back in if that's agreeable. I'm muted. No, I'm not muted. Am I muted? No, I'm not muted. Okay. Yeah, I am message that my internet connection is unstable. I ought to take that moment then before my internet connection cuts me out again to mention that one of the things that I'm most concerned about is supply chains. So supply chains. But so is that a lot of the national policy response and a lot of the policy response in the United States sort of calibrate to New York levels, when really, New York is a drastically different case than other parts of the country. Now, could other parts of the country potentially become like New York City? It depends on how you adjust all the pieces. Yeah, really a possibility. Really far, see that other places will become like New York City. I was working with my uncle a very, very individual, and I thought a persuasive case that a far more libertarian approach might have been more appropriate. That rather than in many cases, and advancing. Well, I mean, I can see arguments in the direction too. I just want to say that really, but it might have been best, perhaps 2 weeks after the initial down measures that, here's everything we know about the virus, right? We'll throw all the information out to the public. This is what public officials would do, is they'd say, okay, go with gun decisions. If you want to, if you want to go to grocery stores, then, you should probably wear a mask. You should probably stay 6 feet away from people, so forth. And this really might have ended up being quite a bit of the libertarian solution is basically to move that decision-making, move the locus of decision-making, not state level, down to the community level, but move as much of that as possible straight down to the level of the individual and say, this is your life and it's your family and you ought decisions. And I found it to be quite persuasive. I can see reasons for particularly because near the beginning we could not be certain was a bad flu season, whether it was a civilization, a plague, right? You know that at the time, but particularly as the numbers have come in, I believe, as I heard looking some of the fatalities of flu season, right, which is a very, very, very bad flu season, right? But it's certainly not civilization ending. I squint at and I think, I haven't seen any elderly people. I don't with any elderly people. It's very clear that young individuals are not very much at risk from this disease. I feel pretty comfortable going and doing whatever I want, and it would be a different story. My calculus would, for instance, I lived with my grandparents, right? That the calculus would change. But in some way, like, I am the best, I am the best arbiter of the best person's decisions about my life is worth and be spent, what activities I should do with it. And that's the liberty case in a nutshell, actually.
Yeah, to move the locus of decision making closer to the individual. I like what you said that, I mean, you are the best place to make decisions about life and death for yourself. And, you might make a wrong choice, but it's on you because the fundamental responsibility is attached to that choice. And then it's yours.
Yeah.
And you have moral ownership of that choice.
Yeah, and I believe that this is actually the core idea undergirds what we would call Western liberal democratic institutions. Not my favorite phrase, but I'll use it because it's the one that we use and understand. I think that this is the real idea undergirding what we call democracy. It's not that everybody should vote and that they should have a role in making the decision that is then imposed from the top down. Instead, I think the core idea of democracy is that each individual should be making decisions about their own life, right? So, and I think that's actually a much better representation of democracy than the voting ideal, because if you think that democracy just means that we all get together and vote on what the top-down monolithic public policy is, then what you end up with is you still end up with a single monolithic solution.
And also,
I think
there's something incredibly demeaning.
Is not that everybody participates in one decision, but that everybody participates in making their own decisions.
Which is closer to the vision of a republic, distributed decision making. Or there's an old Catholic idea called the law of the law of supererogatory function. What is it exactly? It gets cited a whole bunch by the distributivists at the turn of the century. I'm going to have to look it up. But essentially, the idea is that some things can only be decided from the top. Those things should be decided at the top. Anything that theoretically can be decided at a lower level should be shoved downwards to the lowest possible level that can still handle the problem. And so maybe there are problems, and it could be a fairly large list, where you have some problems can only be solved at this level, some could be solved at this level or this level. And then, okay, well, that one needs to be shoved down a level. And it's a general idea that you should shove responsibility as far down the chain as it can go, recognizing that some things won't shove very far, but the effort should be made to shove them as far down that chain as you can get them. I consider that to be a beautiful ideal. Even if it would be more efficient.
Authority and power, and conversely, even that authority and power ought not be seeded up the chain without a fight, fundamentally.
Yeah.
It should not be seeded up the chain without a very good reason.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's the libertarian argument, and I find it fundamentally persuasive.
It's important to distinguish between libertarian and libertarian and libertarian, because there are...
This is a very fair point.
There's a very fair point, because sometimes libertarianism is nothing more than outrage. Nothing but outrage against the idea of being controlled or having any sort of authority figure. And it's really just thinly veiled anarchy. And, some things really can and should be distributed all the way down to the level of the individual, and we really shouldn't care what the individual does. And this serves everybody's interests at some level. I mean, the whole LGBTQ thing is fundamentally a right to do whatever they want and not be restricted on by society more or less arbitrarily. And then you have the exact same thing all over the place with all kinds of other arguments. Freedom of religion operates in much the same way. Please don't stop me from practicing my religion. Get out of my face. I'm going to just go to church.
Freedom of speech fundamentally operates the same way too. It's predicated upon the belief that each individual is a locus of reason, is a locus of decision making, and that they ought to be able to think through their positions and think through them out loud.
And also, I mean, the freedom of speech argument on the other side is always that, my freedom of speech imposes costs around me. It imposes costs of offending people or, causing whatever type of harm my words can cause. And one of the things that you need to understand with a discussion of liberty or of freedom is that there are costs. Sometimes we need to be willing to accept costs as a society. If I support freedom of speech, I need to be able to accept the cost of offense from all corners and say that fundamental good of being able to speak freely and honestly, because fundamentally that's almost the same thing. You need to be able to explore in order to be honest. And exploration can be messy, including exploring ideas in art and satire and all these other things that totally can offend. Absolutely. But the costs that they impose on society are absolutely unequivocally worth it because they're better than any possible alternative you could propose. Yeah. So different levels of libertarian. I'm more of what you'd call, based on that Catholic idea, which I can't remember the word for, of shoving responsibility as far down the chain as it will go. So I recognize that some things need a unit larger than myself. There's a lovely quote, which I often repeat, and I heard it from Nassim Taleb. He apparently got it from somewhere else, but I'll cite him in the meantime, that on a national level, I'm a libertarian. On a state level, I'm a Republican. On a local level, I'm a Democrat. And on a home level, I'm a socialist. Where there's this general idea that the level of control and authority that is appropriate increases as you go down the chain. And by the time you get to the individual, I'm an absolute monarch. So there you go.
I demand control over my own actions.
Yes.
I will unilaterally impose my will upon myself.
Yes, absolutely.
Let's see. There was something about the distributed decision making. Oh yeah, so I find this to be very interesting because, right now, governments who are, discussing what to do about these lockdown measures and thinking about how to reopen the economy are compelled to make what seem like very macabre decisions, right? How much is a human life worth and things like that. And what I'm struck by is I think what, for many of us that can sort of seem kind of macabre and ghoulish, even though, the same sort of calculations go in when we calculate speed limits and things like that. And we do that all the time and don't bat an eye. But I think what makes it seem macabre and ghoulish is actually the fact that it is done on that collectivized level rather than on an individual level. If I decide that it's worth the risk for me to travel on the freeway, that doesn't feel like a macabre or ghoulish decision. It doesn't feel like I don't value my own life or something like
because
that.
The locus of decision making was individual.
It doesn't feel macabre and ghoulish at all. It just feels exactly right. And so I think that I think that the macabre and ghoulish vibe, if you will, comes from the fact that it's done on a collectivized level. And I think if it was left to more local authorities, including perhaps down to the level of the individual, that sort of macabre and ghoulish quality would virtually evaporate.
It's a little bit like
the government sort of mandates, you will go back to work, even though you may expose yourself to the virus, then it does feel macabre and ghoulish. It feels like the government is exercising the power of life and death over me, and it's very uncomfortable.
Which incidentally is what China is currently doing in Wuhan.
I'm doing the same thing when I drive on the freeway. But when I make that decision for myself on the freeway, nobody's saying I have to drive on the freeway. It's an option that I have, right? And when I exercise that option, it just feels empowering. It just feels normal. It just feels like me deciding what to do with my life rather than me being moved around in some kind of technocratic, inhuman, So public policy people, if you're listening right now, you should really take my advice. Just drive the locus of decision making down. Drive the locus of decision making down to the lowest level possible, and no one could possibly accuse you of being, somebody who's weighing human lives in dollar amounts.
It's a weird thing. I was just thinking as you were talking about that, about danger pay. Like if I take a particularly risky job, say fighting forest fires and jumping out of airplanes to do it, um, the compensation, the pay that you receive is, it factors in some of the risk that you're taking, and they call it danger pay, right? You are putting your life at risk, and there's a decent chance that you won't walk out of that forest. And if you of your own free will accept that job, that's kind of cool. I mean, it's honorable in a sense, and it's you know,
Yeah.
and it's exciting. And you can get the advantages of that pay and the things that go with it, and some cool training and jumping out of airplanes, and that's a cool thing. If, on the other hand, someone else plays Russian roulette with the gun pointed at your head, and they're doing the betting, and they set whatever the dollar
Yeah.
amount is for your
If
life,
you're
it's
compelled
an
to do
insult.
that,
It's an insult. I mean, no matter what
yeah.
number they put to that, you're like, it's not infinite, it's not me. But when you yourself are gambling with your own life, it's suddenly acceptable to put dollars and cents to it because you're dealing with your decisions. How much does it take to motivate you to do the thing? I'm not sure I like that phrase. How much
Yeah,
does it
no, I
motivate
couldn't
you?
agree more. And
Please continue.
I mean, when you're making that decision for yourself, it becomes something, alternating along the spectrum from, normal to downright no when you're compelled to do it. It just occurred to me that, I'm thinking more about what I said, that the core idea of democracy is not that we all make decisions together, but that each of us make decisions individually. And what strikes me that's so interesting about that is that in some respects, it seems like a very sort of libertarian, capitalist sort of ideal. But it actually has some very strong resonance in certain strains of Marxist thought, which I find to be totally fascinating and bizarre. The sort of tagline of communism is, seize the means of production, right? And I'm not a huge fan of seizing the means of production. In fact, I'm a huge fan of not seizing the means of production. I think that's generally regarded as theft, and I think it probably should be regarded as theft. However, the ideal of democracy that I'm putting forward, which is a very sort of capitalist libertarian ideal, that every individual is possible, that's not that far off from the idea that every individual should have the means of production,
And
right?
there is this
Every individual
beautiful,
should be enabled to make decisions in their own life and to produce out of their own power.
yeah, yeah, there really is something to that. When I read Marx, I look at his diagnosis of the problem and I'm like, yeah, you're seeing the problem clearly, but your solution is worse than the problem. um, yeah. I mean, there's so many problems
20th
about,
century certainly agrees with you as far as I'm concerned.
and as far as body count is concerned, I, gosh, I have a number of friends who are Marxists, and it requires a level of faith that I will never have, fundamentally, because the amount of suspension of
That's a
disbelief.
special kind of confidence.
Yeah, and it's the kind of confidence that tends to go with, the intellectual. It's always funny to me that Marxism has always been perennially popular among intellectuals and not among the masses, who is supposedly the target audience,
Yes.
which is
Well,
a dark and scary thing. But, you know, it's not sin to say that, he's
I'm
seeing
inclined to
something.
say it's because the masses are smart nonsense, whereas the intellectuals are not. But that's another story.
uh,
So
what's that definition of philosophy? Coming up with bad reasons for things that we came to believe by means other than reason. Yeah, I forget who quoted that. I
um,
recently read that as a
yeah,
quotation
well,
in
and I
Brave
think
New
that if you
World.
could think of specific, um, I'm
So
thinking of this, and all of this sort of a narrative of technocrats that organize everything for
really
everybody.
garbled connection right there. Would you mind repeating that thought?
Yeah, sure. Um, so I'm thinking of sort of the technocratic narrative, the democratic ideal, which is that we're going to talk, we're going to organize everything for everybody, find the solutions for everybody. And I
Basically,
think
the smart people run
the
things because
larger,
they're the experts.
yes, this is, I mean, it goes all the way back to Plato, right? Like, this is not an idea, but it does have new legs with the advent of the consulting profession. It has new legs with the advent of big data and machine learning and things like that.
And hyper
It's used.
specialization in general.
What, yeah, what I find really interesting is that the public policy response to the coronavirus has provided countering evidence, the idea that technocrat really is going to provide some future. I think particularly stories that come around about, municipality out in the park, when what it actually turns out is that sunlight and clean air are probably the best thing the best thing short of a vaccine to kill the virus. And so actually, if you're outside in the park, as long as you're social distancing, you're certainly a lot safer there than you are cooped up in your apartment. And so I just think it's so interesting how, like, the technocratic ideal, the technocratic narrative is that those very intelligent individuals will be able to manage everything for everybody, and they'll have the advantage for everything. And so it's been so interesting to me to watch centralized authority in so many cases, just walk off a cliff again and again, and make stupid decisions again and again.
Or even decisions that are made on the best information available, even with the best training available. I'm thinking about medicine and med school in general. And there is a current among doctors and those who are medically trained to be incredibly dismissive and almost a little offended at those who are interested in alternative medicine, because it's like, if you've gone to medical school and put in the intense amount of suffering that it takes to become a qualified medical doctor and jump through all the hoops required, and you've put in, what is it, something like 12 years of your life by the time you factor in both undergrad and also your graduate school, and then residency on top of that, and massive amounts of debt. And really, you have done everything it takes to become insanely qualified in that area. You have made the sacrifices. And it's almost, from that position, it's easy to see someone who denies modern medicine or starts looking for alternatives as failing to respect or properly regard your sacrifices or the quality of the information that you have. And there's enough miracles in modern medicine that you can point to the long list of miracles, including the titanium rod that's currently holding my femur together, or the emergency surgery that saved my son's life, and point to that and say, look, we do miracles, therefore we can't be thrown out. And my answer to that is yes, we can't throw it out. But that doesn't mean that it's complete or as accurate as it thinks it is all the time. And, you can go way overboard with suspicion. I have a group of friends who are conspiracy theorists to the nth degree, who will swallow every wind of doctrine, if you know what I mean, and every new theory, everything that's anti-authority. And that seems to be the main threat, is that if a theory is counter to authority or claims that there's a conspiracy that's trying to keep you in the dark, they're in. They're in. And that disturbs me.
It's perceived as true by dint of the fact that it runs against prevailing winds.
And that is so incredibly dangerous and, in my opinion, stupid. But there is still something to the impulse to distrust authority in that way, because if you give too much faith or trust to authority, even well-meaning ones, then their blind spots are multiplied by the errors they make in your life. And that's a dangerous thing. And it removes the locus of decision-making from you to the expert. And even if someone else has greater knowledge, they do not have greater responsibility by mere dint of that knowledge. And that's the real key. But, you can be reactionary in the wrong way. And I'll recognize that with everyone else, but it's a real tricky thing. Because too much confidence in authority is almost like yielding that natural-born responsibility we have for our own lives to a degree that is unethical, immoral, or at the very least, lazy and irresponsible.
Yeah, so sometimes you'll get this either with sort of technocratic. The three examples that come to mind most are technocratic, or proponents of the technocratic ideal who will say, well, you don't know what's best for yourself. I'll tell you what's good for you. Right? Or you get this sometimes, for example, with climate change that you made a video about, where there's sometimes, I think, an understandable but still erroneous tendency for individuals, because of the urgency they feel about climate change, to sort of just try to club other people out of the way, and to not try to and with their questions. And my reaction to those are the same as my reaction to the third example, which is that of religious dogma, where I'm not very happy when other people tell me what to believe. I would like to find out what to believe by myself. Thank you. And
it's not even find out what to believe; it's decide what to believe, because fundamentally, as much as we,
that's what I'm getting at.
Yeah, we don't. As much as we like to pretend that beliefs are discovered, they're not. They're decided on. You're constantly deciding which information is relevant or trustworthy, and I believe that you are morally accountable for your beliefs for that reason, because they are chosen. And as much as we would like to pretend that they are not, they are chosen, and for that reason, belief is within that moral domain of choices which ought not to be wrested from me.
Yeah, well, and it's when you get to this level, especially if you think that perhaps the technocrat is occasionally right,
or even most of the time right. Wrong. Sure. Let's even give him a 95%.
I would go that far, but
okay. Granting the premise.
But I'll accept it. Well, it's enough to just take one example, right? In that, should the individual bow to the technocrat? And I'm not so sure. I really do think that there is something, if it was expressed in religious terminology, it would be that there's something divine about the individual. And you could express it a few different ways, right? And you don't necessarily have to certainly be religious in any sort of ordinary sense to believe that there's something special about individuals. But I do think that there is something unique and special about individuals, that they deserve responsibility.
Sure.
And that they deserve sort of agency and responsibility and authority and power over the vast majority of decisions in their lives, which really is a pretty undergirding of this whole channel, frankly.
Yeah. One of the things that really fascinates me about choice is that, where to begin with that thought? One of the things that undergirds this channel in my mind is understanding alternatives. So understanding the simplest way to do things, understanding what the options are, doing a lot of lateral exploration, because if you don't have options, you can't make choices. I mean, at least two, right? If you have less than two choices, then you don't have a choice. And that is a profound thing. There was something I wanted to add to that. Oh, motorcycle riding. So you're doing the live stream series on Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, which has been awesome, by the way. And
Thank you. I'm flattered, especially coming from you.
Well, we'll leave that there. There's a history if you want to read more into that.
Yeah.
But riding a motorcycle is one of those things that is on a so easy to make the argument that it's irresponsible. All on its own. The fact that you're riding a motorcycle, instantly irresponsible, because there's the alternative of, I don't know, a car, which at least has, 4 solid walls around you, and seat belts and airbags.
Airbags are a wonderful thing.
They are. Incidentally, this comes back to my titanium femur. There is something profoundly right about being free to fail. And example, so in driving a motorcycle, I mean, the risk of failure is that, you get dismembered or turned into hamburger by the pavement, or shattered into a million pieces. I mean, these are all things that could really, really happen and are much more likely on the motorcycle than they would be in a car. Among operating room nurses, motorcycles are frequently called donor cycles because the vast majority of young and healthy dead people are on motorcycles for their organs to be, distributed to people who desperately need them. At least in the United States. In China, they just kill Falun Gong practitioners and harvest them alive. But
which is another solution.
Not getting
That
into
was a
that.
little too macabre. That might have been a little too
That was a little too macabre. Anyway, this right to fail, this right to ride a motorcycle with the wind through your hair, even though it's stupid,
Mhm.
because it's your choice. And there's something delicious about that.
Well, and let me
Could I add one
let
more
me
example?
also put one other. Yeah, go ahead. I apologize.
So I'll throw this one more example out, and then you take it. When I was a teenager, I went through this phase where I was in constant battle with my mother over my grades. My mom had very high expectations, which is a sign of love, really. She wanted to see me doing well, and that is a good, noble, wonderful thing, and I do not fault her for it in the least. But on the receiving end of that pressure, I felt that my choices were now subservient to the ends that they were designed to meet. My choice and my freedom, my humanity, I would say, because what a human fundamentally is in my mind is a choosing thing, um, was suddenly less important than the number that came back on my test scores. And,
Mhm.
failing a class or,
For you, there was such thing as a good death.
yes, or a bad sacrifice. The idea of sacrificing freedom for the sake of good grades was not, I mean, it was something that I felt um, so resentful of and hurt by and, so rebellious against. I fought constantly for explicitly the right to fail, just to prove that I was the one making the choices. And then after I, you know, learned that I was making the choices by failing out of piano, then I felt confidence in my ability to make the choice. And at that point, the ends and the suggestions of others were less important. But at that time, during that breakaway phase, which I think everyone goes through or should, um, I needed the moral ownership of my choice, even if that meant failing, even if that meant a lesser outcome, because the thing that was more important was that I was the one making the choice, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
I think it's something you will
Yeah.
viscerally
No,
understand because everyone experiences this.
yes, I think so. I think all teen.
At the very least, right?
Although it's certainly like, I mean, I think you can have. I think you can have the same reaction at various points that you just do not want to be told what to do. You want to be in charge of your own life.
Even if that
I
means
think there's
failing.
even another. Yeah, in terms of the free, another defense of the freedom to fail, a very important defense, and that very important defense is that anything that is both new and good has to come to you through something that is perceived by your current framework as a failure. Um, this is the way we do. Like, let's take an easy example first, right? Think of how many inventions are discovered by accident. They're not found because you're pursuing what you want. Instead, they're found. In sort of the dark area of your awareness, right? If all that you're ever allowed to do is, like, if you're limited to what the current framework prescribes as good and acceptable, then you'll side of that framework that are also good and acceptable, right? And all of this is predicated on the Delhi argument that any given system is incomplete, consistent. Take your choice, right?
One or the other.
Think of also, when you don't know what to do, what do? Well, you try out a few things, right? You don't and things. The attitude with which you pursue that is not, this is going to go, I know what's going to happen. Instead, it's, I don't know if this is going to work. In fact, perhaps I have perhaps I have some reasons that I believe it won't work. It's like my best option, so I'm going to go ahead and try it.
Even doing science in
If you limit
general.
yourself entirely to the known, you can never find those good things in the unknown. Yeah, go ahead. This is all. Yeah, go ahead and give the example, and then I'll offer my thought on it.
So in science, there's two ways to go about it. There's the dumb way, which is to try to verify your conclusions, and then there's the smart way, which is to try to falsify your conclusions, because the fundamental way that the logic of science works is that it only has certainty when it falsifies, never when it verifies, When you verify, you're only building confidence, not building certainty. And so good experiment design is built out of this mental framework that you are trying to falsify your own idea. And then success, bizarrely, is failure. If the experiment fails to prove wrong your idea, then your idea has survived, and that's kind of a success.
I've thought of an even better example, which is that when you ride a bicycle, the way that you fundamentally learn to ride a bicycle is by failing to ride a bicycle at least 20 times.
Sure.
Right.
And that's
the case whenever you learn something new, is that you can count on failing some unspecified number of times, and that unspecified number of times might be quite high, and those failures might be moderately to highly costly, right? Joseph, you have children, right? Like when they learn to ride a bike, they will come home with their own fair share of scraped knees. And you just have to decide, some degree of failure is perfectly fine because it's a necessary condition for cultivating the ability to ride a bike. And the ability to ride a bike, that sort of human capability, and worth the scraped knees.
There's something I want to add in.
The same logic I think you and I would both say, would apply to larger scale decisions, to your example of the freedom to fail and so forth, is that the capability of success in some sense requires the freedom to fail, right? And it is worth that. It's absolutely worth that.
So if I was going to push back against that idea, the way that I would do it is to say, well, scraped knees aren't life-ending, which means the cost of failure is fairly low. So sure, we can allow those failures, but what about existential failures? What about, with the example of COVID-19, what about yourself or someone else dying because of the choice that you made?
Let's simplify it and say yourself, just for the sake of the argument.
Let's simplify. So that does simplify it a lot. And then the motorcycle example comes in. I mean, that's something that both you and I have done, is ride motorcycles. I don't do it anymore because I have made the risk calculation again and decided I want to see my kids grow up. So at least for the time being, I'm not riding. Although now that I've moved to the country, I must admit I've been sorely tempted. Less city driving. I think it's important to say that my freedom is worth more than my death. And that, famously was said by Patrick Henry in the lead up to the American Revolution: give me liberty or give me death. Mm-hmm. And, the defiance in his words is awesome. But more than just defiance, that really is the risk calculus. That's the risk calculus that is the more moral one to make. It is better to say that my freedom is genuinely, fundamentally worth more than my life. It's a very stoic way to go about it. Because my choice is fundamentally, yeah. Tell me.
I was just thinking of another argument in favor of that, right? So, probably the safest possible life you could live is if, we covered you in bubble wrap and locked you in a room, and fed you through an intravenous tube or something like that. We had, some kind of system to carry away your waste and so on and so forth. Right?
And some way to work out your muscles so you didn't atrophy to death.
Extremely, extremely safe. Sure. Right. I mean, we could make that individual extremely, extremely safe. But it actually turns out that humans, generally speaking, would actually not be very satisfied with that kind of life. They would want to push the boundaries of that kind of life, and you would almost start to question if that kind of life, to what degree it was a human life at all. It certainly would not approximate the ideal of what most of us would consider to be a human life, right? This is getting dangerously close to the question of, should you cut off life support for somebody who's in the vegetable can enter into that. But my point here is that, we tend to think of quality in life and life as two separate values, but it actually seems to me that they're more unified, because part of the value of a life is all the exploring and unfolding that will happen over the course of that life, right? It's all the interactions that they will have with the world around them and all the interactions they will have with people. And that's intimately linked to the quality of life as well. right? So I don't think you can ultimately untangle the two. And I think the fact that you can't untangle the two really does argue in favor of what you were saying and what Patrick Henry is saying, that there not be worth living, and that that freedom and capability would be worth a risk to your life.
Yeah.
In at least some situations.
I agree. I think
most of us act that way when we drive on the freeway. So everybody agrees with us, really.
They
just don't say they do.
The thing about freedom is that freedom and responsibility go together to the point where you can almost say that it's a necessary relationship. If you have the freedom, you have the responsibility. If you have the responsibility, you ought to have the freedom. And the argument I will make is that there are some things that are your responsibility whether you want them to be or not. And so you should have the freedom to do it. And freedom, freedom from external restraint is important there. It's such a complicated, fiddly thing, because drawing the lines exactly of what is essential in personal freedom is a really difficult thing. And I mean, we have to make all kinds of sacrifices. We agree to the speed limit when we drive. One thing that I am generally very uncomfortable with is prior restraint, and I'm growing more uncomfortable with it as I think about it more. In the United States, our First Amendment jurisprudence.
What is prior restraint?
Okay, so the idea of arresting someone for drunk driving is, if they drive drunk, they may cause future harm. And we don't want harm to happen, and so in the interest of protecting, we are going to place a restraint on someone prior to the time of the harm. And so we're going to restrain them before the harm happens to prevent the thing from happening. And I generally think that the law should back off of literally all prior restraint or the idea of preventing harm, that is not an acceptable role, at least when dealing with the citizenry. Maybe it's acceptable when dealing with war, but even then it gets fiddly really fast, because you start making a mockery of justice when you start trying to predict the future and claiming that it's certain that if someone does this, then this thing will happen. After the fact, if you
like Project Insight from Captain America: The Winter Soldier.
100%. Incidentally, I'm hoping to rewatch that movie tonight, because I've been thinking these themes. Every time you try to stop a war before one starts, as he says in Civil War, innocent people die. And that one that quote is so good. So the way this would work with coronavirus is, instead of having prior restraint, deal with this with the way the court system has done it for a very long time. And what you would say is, if you can prove within a reasonable degree of certainty that someone infected you with a disease and you suffered harm by it, you should be able to recover the harm from them. And so you restrain them or punish them for harm that they caused after, and only after, they cause it. And you could argue and say, well, that doesn't bring back people's lives, but if we're dealing with a choice between life and freedom, this is one way to tip the balance in favor of freedom. And incidentally, this is the way we deal with free speech issues in the United States. No prior restraint on speech. You can say what you want, and if it crosses or crossed the line where it actually caused physical harm, like shouting fire in a crowded theater, they don't stop you from saying that before you say it. They punish you after, which is such a different way of dealing with things than the whole let's protect people from harm idea, which inherently, eternally
by the way,
crushes freedom.
As far as I can tell, it generally works. It's not like you have many people crying or shouting fire in a crowded theater.
No, I mean, the incentives take care of much of that, and even if they didn't, even if it happened more often, I still think it's a better way to handle the problem.
Well, we've been going for about 53 minutes. I'm kind of curious. I'd actually like to talk about the supply chain just for a few minutes, although I'm concerned that it will spiral out of control. But if it's agreeable to you, I'd love to talk about supply chain issues for just...
Absolutely. Let's go for it. And
what would you like to do?
I have a suspicion that's going to jump into seizing the means of the production in the distributivist rather than the Marxist way.
So So I've been really interested as I've watched the response. I was talking to my brother the other day. My brother's getting a PhD in finance from an Ivy League university, so he's a pretty smart individual.
Can
Um,
confirm.
and is probably one of, oh, thank you. Yeah, I'll let him know. One of the most authoritative individuals whom I know regarding economics, whom I know personally, right? So I just ran through a thought experiment with him the other day, right? And the thought experiment went like this. Okay, what happens if one day nobody goes into work? And what he said, actually, this is kind of a funny answer, is he said, well, you'd expect GDP to go down by 365th of what annual GDP is if nobody works for one day, right? Laughed at that. I said, well, I think actually probably GDP would go up, right? Because you'd get a day off, you'd get a break, right? And anyway, so those are the kind of the funny responses. But the more serious answer here is that if people don't work for one day, pretty much nothing bad happens, right? I mean, this is fundamentally what happens if you take the weekend off or if you go on vacation. You don't work, and guess what? The world keeps turning, right? And then I said, okay, well, let's ask another question. I was talking to my brother, and I said, well, let's ask another question. Let's go to the other end of the spectrum. Let's say that nobody ever goes to work ever again, right? And the answer is you all die, right? At some point, the electrical grid shuts off because people stop working on that. At some point, the toilets start backing up. At some point, your car breaks down. You can't fix it. You can't refill it with gas anyway because the reservoir at the gas station has emptied out. At some point, falling apart. Actually, long before that, your food disappears, right? And so there's sort of two ends of the spectrum here, right? If you never, ever, ever work again, if you don't work for just one day, that's actually probably just fine, right? Whereas if you don't ever work again, then everybody will literally die. And, the fundamental reason for this is that the economy and our jobs, are partially about money. They're partially about sort of like, just numbers in a bank account, right? But the economy is also very much about very real products and services. And it actually turns out that if people don't work today, then electricity, and you can't watch Netflix, you can't have a conversation on Zoom, you can't even turn on the lights, right? And then in the slightly longer term, your food in the fridge starts going bad because there's no electricity, and so you have to eat it all really fast, and then you have no food, and then you die, right?
That escalated
There's
quickly.
people stocking the grocery store shelves, and there's nobody driving food to your location, and there's nobody raising pigs to be slaughtered, and there's nobody raising corn, to turn into Fritos, right? So there's sort of two ends of the spectrum here, right? You can stop working for one day, but you can't stop working forever. So the question in my mind from the very beginning has been, okay, how long can you do this, right? So can you shut down an economy for 2 weeks without everybody dying? What about 4 weeks? What about 6 months? How about a year, right? And to run that kind of fine-grained nation than I personally have. But, at progressive points along that path, there are real penalties and real damages that are incurred on people's lives. It's not that just that you stay home and you don't have a job. It's that you can't eat, and you can't. Those are real problems. This isn't, a problem for billionaires. It's not a problem for the stock market. It's a problem for every human being who has an electrical system in their house, or who has a biological system that depends upon the ingestion of calories, which last I checked is all 7.5 billion people. So
Yeah.
I guess the sum total of this is I've just been watching this whole thing the whole time and thinking, okay, how long can we shut down the economy, and what kind of consequences are going to come from that? Because the consequences there are going to be real consequences. It's not just that, some imaginary number next to your retirement account goes down, right? Like actual products will cease to arrive at your house, right? Your actual quality of life will change, and then eventually, if it persists, your life will end, right? And I'm not suggesting that you can, that we should reopen everything right now necessarily, run around, hug each other, hug strangers, kiss old people, and breathe in each other's faces, right? That's not the point here. But the point is that there's a real cost to shutting down production, right? Because of the way our economy is set up. And there will be real penalties for that, right? And you've about how like Wendy's is facing some supply shortages. I think Kroger Kroger Grocers, I think, is facing some supply shortages. Anyway, so
Yeah.
this is me railing about, the fact that you have to reopen the economy. And I think this is the point where you entered the conversation, Joseph, and tell us to grow our own food.
Grow your own food. There, did I do it? So I couldn't agree more. For one thing, growing grass is silly. Really, do you need a green carpet outside? Unless you're playing soccer on it every weekend, that space could be growing raspberries. Raspberries are superior to green carpet outside. Or corn, because I'm a huge fan of corn. I was just thumbing through a book today called The Resilient Gardener, which is all about how to grow corn, beans, squash, and potatoes in order to put yourself in a position where shocks to the global economy and to the system in general will not hurt you. And one concept that I use to unify my thoughts around this is siege warfare. Make yourself impervious to siege. If you have food stored away and some capacity to grow your own, to a certain degree, maybe never entirely, in fact, I'll say never entirely, the global supply chain just doesn't matter to you. My wife and I have made a habit out of maintaining a small stockpile of food at all times, no matter what apartment we've lived in. And basically, it's just an extended pantry. We have a pantry, and we have a little bit extra, and some bulk foods of the kind that have a lot of calories and not a lot of nutrition, like bags of dried beans and a couple 50-pound sacks of wheat, which incidentally, if I wanted to sell those on the free and open market right now that people are starting to realize how dependent they are, I could sell a bucket of wheat for $120, where before it would have been, 20, 30, 40. It's crazy what prices have done, but, the stockpile has been really helpful for us in these last 7 weeks of living at home off of our food storage. It's been a handy thing. And now I'm starting to get seeds in the ground with the garden that I'm putting in the backyard. And it is of deep comfort to me. I would like, if I have my druthers, so there's so many ways that this whole coronavirus pandemic could go. One way it could go is that totalitarian measures like the ones that we have seen become normal. If that happens, that's a huge tragedy. We could see China re-cementing its hold on power over its own people and its propaganda network across the planet. That would be unfortunate. Or, and this is what I'm hoping, and maybe this is what I'm hoping. I hope that more people garden. Maybe not everybody, definitely not everybody, but more. I'm hoping more people have food and money stored aside for later times. I hope more people avoid debt a little more carefully than they do normally, particularly consumer debt. Why on earth you would sign up to a financing plan for a non-essential thing is beyond me. Those three things: less debt, more food storage, more gardening. If we did those three things, the whole world radically changes, because the level of our dependence on the supply chain is lessened, and the amount of security that we have at the individual level. I mean, this freedom security thing doesn't have to be an either or. That's freedom, individual choices, creating individual security. And that would be beautiful. So that's what I'm doing. After this is all over, I'm going to restock my food storage. I'm going to make sure I have a little bit of money set aside. And then I'm going to make sure that I keep learning how to garden. Yeah.
I mean, I endorse those suggestions, right? And I'm cautiously, I just have to comment, I haven't commented everything in chat. I kind of ignored chat. I'm sorry, chat. But John just mentioned I started growing potatoes just in case.
Good on you, John.
Look, I don't actually think that there will be a famine.
I don't think that either.
I know that I would rather have grown potatoes and be ready for a famine than to have a famine and not have grown potatoes.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, to me, that's just that's a fairly fairly obvious calculation. And I think I'd note that I'm cautiously optimistic. And what will be the consequences of this, right? Will it be that people will demand sort of a more technocratic, draconian control over their lives?
Realization.
A la sort of contact tracing and that sort of thing. Or, will there sort of be a backlash against it? And, I'm cautiously optimistic that there will be a backlash against that kind of technocratic ideal, and the consequences of this in the, let's say, the short to medium, maybe the long term, will be that, you know, lots of people will think seriously their confidence in the ability of other people to make decisions for themselves, and their understanding of the necessity to take responsibility for one's own life will will grow. I'm cautiously optimistic that sort of thing will happen, and I think part of it is because, you know, the technocrats cannot resist doing stupid things every now and again.
And the beautiful thing about
they can't resist doing stupit, tyrannical, petty things every now and again.
And the beautiful thing about mass media is that those stupid, petty things become national news and become the, shall we say, the glowing counterexample to the idea that technocracy is the way to go.
Probably, yeah.
Yeah. We better wrap up.
Yeah.
This has been a delightful chat. Thank you.
Grow potatoes, people.
Grow potatoes. Sweet potatoes, corn, beans, squash. Viva la revolucion.
Yep. Let's seize the vines of production.
Seize the seeds of production.
Grow the vines of production.
Grow your own production. Grow your own produce.
Yeah.
Yeah. Glorious.
This is what Marx was missing.
Yeah. Frankly, if he had stopped with his diagnosis, which is that dependence is a cruel master, and said, seize the means of production as an individual. Buy the tools of your own trade. Plant your own garden. I could have gotten behind him, but this whole collective control thing and letting other people be responsible for my life and livelihood, again, just through the state instead of the corporation, nope, not doing it.
By the way, I won't. I'll say it another time. We do need to close.
Okay, we'll close.
Right,
see you guys.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
For all of you, whether you're watching or listening now or at some point in the future, thanks so much. We hope you enjoyed it, and we enjoyed reading the chat, and we thank you for your continued support.
Thank you.